Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you so much for making the time to
Not a problem.
talk. Well, okay. So one of my first questions was, I was in China between 2008 and 2010. So
Mhm.
I was there for the Olympics
Right.
and I was in Beijing for a year and then Shanghai for about a year and a half. And I can count on one hand the number of people I met who had been in China, Westerners who had been in China in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
So as somebody who, got to travel around mainland China and see what it was like and hear some things about the Cultural Revolution. Like, I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. So my first trip to China was in 1969. And, I remember it was all quite exciting. We took the train from Hong Kong to the border. We got off the Hong Kong train, walked across. There was a bridge at Lo Wu and then into Shenzhen, which is a very small fishing village. The loudspeakers were blaring slogans, Mao's work, martial music, and that was a constant when you were in China in those days, was the, you know, omnipresence of propaganda on the walls, across loudspeakers, wherever you were.
Wow.
And then they had this sort of system where they put the Westerners in a room, they put the Japanese in another room, they put the overseas Chinese, the patriotic, I
Mm-hmm.
ball, patriotic patriots, compatriots. And then you sat in a train, and the train took you into Guangzhou, and there were more martial music and constantly filling up your teacup. And it was amazing. I mean, Guangzhou in those days was a very laid back, slow, there was a car every 3 minutes. I could rent a pedicab and tour around the city. In some ways, it was quite pleasant, other than the fact that it was very poor.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of everything was run down. And it was like the other side of the moon. It was just so different with all of the propaganda. And most of the vehicles were, and there weren't very many of them, were sort of
Mm-hmm.
either official limousines or army vehicles. And I attended the Canton Trade Fair. We would have Canadian business people there who were buying, China ware or textiles or whatever they were buying from China. And
Mm-hmm.
my job was to go around and assist them if they had any problems, help out with the translation. There was the odd Canadian exporter, which is essentially supposed to be our job as a trade commissioner to help, Canadian exporters. There weren't that many of them. The but yeah, it was fun. We'd head out there are lots of foreigners staying at the Dongfang Bingguan, the
Mm-hmm.
hotel Westerners. And I remember, and we used to sit at the top of the Fang, as we called it, was this restaurant on the top floor. And all you had to like, there were no foreign drinks. You couldn't buy whiskey. You had Chinese whiskey and constant propaganda. And the story was told, although I didn't see this happen, that there was a German who basically, it was just eventually too much for him, and he threw his beer at a portrait of Chairman Mao.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that guy was grabbed by about 8 people, driven to the border, and flung across the border back into Hong Kong. So it was a bit much, but there were compensations. We would go out to Chinese restaurants, and they would have, well, of course, in China, the restaurants are Chinese, but they had a section which was very nice with white tablecloth for foreigners, and you walked through a
Mm-hmm.
dirtier section where the locals were, and our prices were much higher. So instead of being 30 cents for a meal, it was like $1 for a meal. So we would
Mm-hmm.
have the most fabulous food,
Oh yeah.
Mao Tai and the whole works, at that time, Mao Tai was cheap. We didn't think it was very good. Still don't think it's very good, but now it's expensive. But you'd have fabulous food, fabulous food. We a group of 5, 6, 10 of us of different nationalities, Brits. There weren't that many Americans for some reason at that time, but Brits, Germans, whatever. We'd head out and we split the meal, and it was like a couple of dollars each. So it was
Yeah.
fun. It was
You
fun.
in your book you talk a lot about food and language.
Right.
And one of the things I miss about China is the meals. The food
Right.
culture there is incredible, and
Mhm.
as you go region to region, Chengdu, Harbin, and I think you went to Harbin at one point.
I did. Yep. Yep.
Dongbei food I think ended up being my favorite out of all of them. With lots of sauces and very hearty foods. But the food culture in China is incredible. Sitting down for meals, and we were always getting invited out by locals to go to the local restaurant, and with the lazy Susans and everything like that.
China, despite the best efforts of the Communist Party to sort of suppress a lot of the old culture, I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
culture is so deep there.
Mm-hmm.
Many years, you can't wipe it out. And so once things opened up in the 80s and the 90s, things came back. Artistic expression came back. Restaurants, of course, they've always had a great ability to make things. A lot of the sort of scientific achievements of Western culture that we identify with, the West, a lot of, and which, of course, inevitably, it's the accumulation of developments all over the world that come together. Like, and the Chinese, they had, metallurgical technology 2,000 years ago. Obviously, the famous inventions, the compass and gunpowder and
Mm-hmm.
printing paper, and so there's been a tremendous technological bent in China. And of course, once the Communist Party comes in and suppresses everything, one person decides, one party decides, you sort of basically suppress the natural creativity of people.
Mm-hmm.
Once the lid was lifted, not politically, but at least economically, in terms of economic activity, then all kinds of things have flowered in China. And I've been back a few times. I saw the evolution sort of late 70s, early 80s, gradually things were loosening up. And then I saw that, early 2000s was perhaps the peak of when things were open. And now, unfortunately, things are closing down again. But yeah, I followed all of those evolutions.
Yeah. I was there from 2008 to 2010, and it was glorious. I mean, it was really, it was opening up. One of the things that you mentioned about suppression that I thought was really funny is, for an ostensibly communist country, like, it's the most capitalist place I've ever been, in the sense of, everything's for sale. You can negotiate for everything. The markets where there's just so much activity going on, like, it is sort of a naturally entrepreneurial people as well, which I found really interesting.
Well, yeah, terms like communist or fascist or socialist, they're tossed around by people that don't really know what they mean. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the term communist means public ownership of all the means of production. That's what it means. And so in the early years of communist China, people were executed for being capitalists,
Mm-hmm.
allowed to hire people. It was evil to hire people. If you hired someone, you were exploiting them.
Mm-hmm.
Today, there's all kinds of, so China today is communist only in the sense that it's ruled by the Communist Party. But
Yeah.
there's nothing communist about how their economy is organized. They have fewer social benefits than most Western countries. If you're old and sick, you just die.
Mm-hmm.
No, there's nothing more old, sick, and poor. And of course, the wealth differential today is probably greater than it was before the communists took over. So, in
Mm-hmm.
no sense, it's in a communist country, but it's controlled by the Communist Party, which is like the big mafia that runs the country.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll say, with President Xi taking over and the changes that have happened in the last, 5 to 7 years, pretty much all of my Western friends have left at this point. There's
Yeah,
maybe one person I know who's over there, which is kind of sad, because there was a lot of foreigners in China, a lot of businesses being started, a lot of businesses coming over. Somebody who works in import export, a lot of international trade happening. That's,
right.
I mean, obviously still happening to a degree, but when you look at the charts, it's dramatically falling.
No, it's really too bad because as someone who was a keen student of Chinese, there in the 70s, difficult to talk to people. People were afraid to talk to you, by
Mm-hmm.
and large, with a few exceptions. And then to go there in the early 2000s, and all of a sudden I can talk to anybody I want, and we can argue about all kinds of stuff, and we can disagree and have a beer, and
Mm-hmm.
wow, China's really opening up. And then to see it now sort of closing down again, it's sad. And there's so many Chinese who somehow think that having the country controlled by a central government that has a firm hand and tells you what to do. Oh, we need that because we have to be unified. If we're not unified, somehow we'll all fall apart. And there's
Mm-hmm.
no evidence of that. In fact, the evidence is quite the other way, that if you allow people to be creative, to represent their interests. So if there's a polluting factory in a town, the citizens get organized and protest against it. If they don't like their leader, they can vote someone else in. All of that stuff is good. It's not bad. And unfortunately, there's far too many Chinese, including many who live in Western countries, are persuaded that the strength of China depends on having a strong central government. And
Yeah.
I don't know, whatever, it's their country, they'll do what they want. But no, for me, getting back to the late 60s, early 70s, it was quite an adventure learning Chinese. I really enjoyed it. It was a major discovery. And I certainly, whatever are the political ups and downs in China, the culture there is so deep and of such great interest from so many points of view, historical, literature, science, you name it, that and it's at the base of many of, or at least has had a major influence on other languages and cultures in the Far East.
Mm-hmm.
And so, tackling Chinese characters is no easy task, but I certainly recommend it. It's a wonderful journey. Wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did. I got to HSK level 4 when I was at my peak. So it was about, I think it was about 2,000 characters or so. And it's some of it stuck with me. I mean, one of the problems with characters, you talk about this a lot in your book about how, repetition is that characters, especially, they tend to slide from your grasp without practice. But
Well, I mean, everything does that.
yeah.
You have to not only repeat, and I used to write them out by hand.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
a repetition is important, but also being engaged with them all the time. So if you're reading a lot, you're seeing them in different contexts. You may not recognize it in one context, you recognize it in another context. Every time you come across a character and recognize it, you are strengthening your hold on that character. So if you
Mm-hmm.
listen at all, like the best example is writing the characters. If you stop writing those characters, there's no way you can all of a sudden, a couple of years later, just pick it up and start writing them.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very complex, 8 strokes, 10 strokes, 12 strokes. How can you remember all that stuff? So yeah, you got to stay with the characters. Reading, once you reach a certain level, like I think I have perhaps 4,000 characters. Once you have a certain level, like I can always read them. I can't write them at all. And yet when I took my exam, I had to write a diplomatic note in Chinese. I had to translate news
Mm-hmm.
editorials into Chinese. So my characters were ugly, but I could write them.
Yeah. I was just over in Korea last month for my honeymoon, and I was pleasantly surprised at how many of the characters I could read there. Because they use, I mean, obviously they use Korean writing, but for a lot of the place names and in the
Yep.
subways and things like that, they use Chinese characters, as well as the fact that Chinese is sort of the big tourist and business. It's Chinese. China and the United States are the two countries they do the most business with, and those are the two languages that everybody there is learning. So a lot of signs would be in 3 languages, or if it was 2 languages, a lot of times it would actually be dual Korean and Korean and Mandarin. All right, I have another question for you. One of the things you wrote, speaking of books, that I have, really was attuned to from my own experiences. You said reading a full length book is like climbing a mountain.
Right.
And personally, I have copies of The Little Prince in about a dozen different languages because I tend to use this as my first novel to
Right.
read when I'm learning a language. Uh, Personally, one of the things I find is that if I'm rereading something, it also becomes a little bit, I can focus more on the language because you know the story, you're not getting as lost. I also credit reading a ton of science fiction in French to being like the main way that I actually learned to get pretty good at French. And I thought that this was brilliant. I was really glad you wrote this, and wanted to ask what other linguistic milestones would you recommend for people, as they are on the path towards fluency in a language?
Well, reading is so big because reading is the best way of acquiring new vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
So, and obviously, you have to balance your interest in the subject matter with your familiarity with the subject matter. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you read the Little Prince in different languages, you're familiar with it, but it may not be that interesting after a while.
Mm-hmm.
So, on the other hand, you may have something that's very interesting, but too difficult, or you're not familiar with the subject matter. And I'm not a big fan of science fiction, so I would find science fiction very difficult to read
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
language because I'm not familiar with it. So, but other milestones, I mean, I'm a big believer in vocabulary, that you need a lot of passive vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
Some people say, oh, any word you learn, you got to use it right away and stuff. And I don't believe that. I think you have to keep exposing yourself to the sounds and the way the words are written, and gradually acquiring a large passive vocabulary. And
Mm-hmm.
that forms the base then of what you're going to be able to say. And you will only ever be able to use a small subset of your passive vocabulary. But, we measure your passive vocabulary at Link, and I kind of think that 5,000 known words, the way we count them, is kind of a minimum level before I would start speaking to someone. So that becomes a bit of a milestone. Once I have that much passive vocabulary, probably, and I will have listened to a lot, because typically whatever words I've learned through reading, because that's how we count
Mm-hmm.
them up. And if I've read it, then I've listened to it. So I've got a sufficient level of comprehension that I can actually start talking to someone, say online or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I'll understand a good part of what they're saying, and I'll have this collection of passively known vocabulary, some of which I'll be able to retrieve, some of which I won't be able to retrieve, but at least I have a chance.
Mm-hmm.
So something like 5,000 words, passive vocabulary, as we measure them. And at Link, we measure each form of the word as a different word. So in the case of Spanish, each conjugation form is a different word, and plural is a different word. So it's the only way we can count them automatically, but it's still an indicator. So 5,000 words is a bit of a milestone for me. But the reality is that eventually we need 40,000, 50,000 words.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you made the distinction between passive and retrieving the words. This is something I have definitely found, where the ability to understand someone speaking, where you're understanding 80-90% of what they're saying, that comes before my ability to fluently say everything I need to say. And I actually talk a lot about muscle memory when it comes to language. I'm still not 100% sure if this is actually the most accurate, neurological way of describing it, but it does feel like you get to a point where you can let the language wash over you. And a lot of times you get that, you almost that switch flipping moment when you change from, actively trying to understand and maybe doing translation in your head to realizing, oh, I can just sit back and I can understand what's being said. But then it's a totally different skill to be able to rattle that off extremely fast. And that itself takes lots and lots and lots of conversation practice.
Oh, yeah. To speak well, you have to speak a lot. I think people have unrealistic expectations. They think, I understand well and I can read, but I can't speak. Well, then maybe you have to speak more eventually, you know. You just have to start pulling these words out. But still, the comprehension is key, because if you don't understand what the person is saying, it's very difficult to have a conversation. If you're struggling to say things, there's workarounds using the vocabulary that you're comfortable using, using structures that work. Maybe you suppress words that don't belong. And actually, this is exactly the process. The brain does those three things. The brain will trot out the easiest to use words, and then we'll go to structures that have worked before. But then it also has to suppress if you're speaking Korean, you don't want the Chinese to jump in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the thing, and it's a process that you gradually get better and better at doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so people shouldn't be, frustrated or impatient if they, as long as they can understand 80%, and even if there's things they don't understand, you can always ask, I beg your pardon, would you repeat that? If it's 5 or 10%. But if it's 50%, you haven't got a conversation. So,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, build up the passive vocabulary and then work on your, ability to retrieve the words without getting frustrated or impatient.
Yeah. Speaking of asking questions, you talk about people's fear of being rejected by language. I think you describe it as language groups, essentially
Mm-hmm.
people who are learning a language, being kind of timid about talking with, speaking with native speakers. And one of the things you said, which again, from my own experience, I found 100% accurate, is that typically it's the reverse. And my story about that is when I was in Barcelona, I was learning Catalan because it's dual. You spent time over there, although I think you were there during. I know you were there during Franco, so
Right.
at that point, Catalan might have been more repressed. When I was there, oh,
Um,
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, I wasn't attuned to those issues, so I couldn't tell you.
Yeah,
They did
well,
have Catalan. I do remember on the buses
mm-hmm,
had a slogan. 25. I don't speak Catalan. 25 anis de pau.
mm-hmm,
Anis de paz. So they had it in Catalan on the buses. So obviously, and that was the government. That was Franco promoting his 25 years of peace and promoting the message in Catalan. So people must
wow.
have Catalan.
So I guess Franco had actually kind of warmed to Catalan to a certain extent too. When I showed up there for university,
Yeah.
without knowing it, half of my classes were being taught in Catalan, which I
Mm-hmm.
probably could have figured out ahead of time, but just it was a bit of a surprise to me. Um, but I ended up learning it through that, again,
Right.
passively taking these linguistics classes. And then also found like everybody who I'd meet that was there, if I mentioned I was studying Catalan, the first thing they would do is, invite me out to a beer or say, "Oh, let's go.
Right.
I can teach you Catalan." Like, I mean, it was
Right.
one of the Catalans are famous for being not the warmest of the Spaniards, who I think that would be more the Andalusians. But if you're studying Catalan there, it is very easy to make friends.
Mm-hmm. I've always found the people in Barcelona or wherever, Catalans are very friendly and welcoming.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but I'm sure if you were learning their language, they would even be more welcoming. I can see that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, Have you had, and you've studied quite a few niche languages. Have you had a similar experience where with smaller languages, people tend to be even more kind of, excited about the prospect of you learning, willing to
Yeah.
help?
It depends what you call a niche language. I guess Czech it's not a niche language, but certainly the people reacted very positively, but so do the Poles. The Poles are
Mm-hmm.
4 times the population of the Czech Republic. Ukrainians, and that's also not niche. That's also 40 million people.
Yeah.
I think in general, you want to talk about people who warm to you if you're learning their language is the Persians, the Iranians. They just
Really?
oh, in fact, I get a more positive reaction from them than just about anyone
Oh, that's
when
amazing.
you're speaking their language. So I think it's perhaps in those languages where people don't expect you to be learning their language. I'm sure if I
Yeah.
tried to Finnish, that I would get a very positive reaction. It's more where you have speakers of languages where there are a lot of people who are studying those languages. Obviously, English. If we see someone struggling to learn English, we're not impressed. Like, why don't you speak better? Almost is
Mm-hmm.
everyone should speak English. I mean, in Quebec, you get a very positive reaction if you speak French. But again, it's almost more expected now than certainly was the case 50 years ago. But in Germany, if you go there and you speak German, you better speak it well, or else they're going to reply in English, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So different expectations. The same in France. Different expectations in different countries.
Yeah. Although to your point, this is why I think more English speakers should really try and learn another language, at least
Mhm.
semi-fluently, to just do the walk a mile in their shoes thing, because there is a lot of attitude towards people in certain places who don't speak English, as well as they would like. But for somebody who's, actually gone to the trouble of learning a language, like, it's
Hmm.
really hard and it takes a lot of time. And I think that if people, maybe some monolingual English speakers, like focused a little, spend a little more time at that, they'd realize what a feat it is for them to even get to, for someone to even get to semi-fluency.
It depends where we are too. Like if you're in a foreign country, if I'm in, I don't know, Iran, someone speaks English very well. Like I'm always impressed on television when I see people being interviewed in different countries, and they're interviewed in English and they speak English very, very well with an
Mm-hmm.
accent. Never bothered me at all. But when we're in North America, and if you have someone, like I was talking to someone the other day who was actually, I think it was with a bank, or with maybe it was with a telephone service provider in Vancouver. And he had a very strong Chinese accent. I could hardly understand what he was saying. And he's
Mm-hmm.
providing a service to people in Vancouver. Well, he shouldn't be in that position. So I think there are expectations for certain situations.
Yeah.
And you're in North America and you're dealing with the public, the expectation is that you speak well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with an accent, doesn't have to be perfect, but should be clearly understandable. The trouble with Cantonese is that they don't, whatever they're called, the end, you know, uh, if it ends in a K or a G, you aren't getting that. I thought, not I
Uh-huh.
thought, I thought. And he said, go to your profile. My what? My profile. So I think there are expectations, and I say that too. Like if you work in a foreign language and you send out correspondence, your spelling better be correct. Now,
Mm-hmm.
spelling is an issue, a much bigger issue in English than in other languages because our spelling system is so irregular.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, if you're just sending a business letter and you're, I don't know, on a more personal basis, a lot of these things don't matter. But there are certain professional requirements which would be higher for language skills. But if you're just interacting with someone, then yeah, we shouldn't criticize other people, and we shouldn't correct them either, for that matter.
Yeah. I mean, unless they're asking for it. But yeah, this is like, I mean, I'm a software engineer, and this is like me showing up to a gig and saying like, "Oh, yeah, I don't know that programming language. Sorry, I can't if it's part of the job, it's part of the job."
Mm-hmm.
And there is obviously such a high level of language learners these days that I can see that being a little frustrating. I have another question for you. This is
Sure.
actually not a non-language one, but I was really interested in your history of doing wood importation, and that
Mm-hmm.
you run a. From what I can tell, you're still president of the was it KP Wood?
Yeah, I may have a title there. I'm not sure, but I don't get involved. There are people running
Nice.
that.
Well, one of your descriptions I just found I found that I really loved was you talking about sitting in wood rooms in Japan. And I've been thinking about this a lot because, as you know, in 2023 everything is like artificial and synthetic and drywall and everything like that. So what I was wondering if you just talk a little bit about, honestly, like wood and your love of wood in Japan, and a little bit about that, because I just found myself like really interested in that.
Wood to me is a wonderful material.
Mm-hmm.
It's renewable. If we are talking about the temperate sort of softwood, temperate forests generally, there are greater, more areas of forest today than there were 100 years ago. Like the forest is not going away. I'm not going to
Mm-hmm.
talk about what happens in Brazil or in Indonesia, but insofar as softwood is concerned, there's no shortage of softwood trees. So it is renewable. Every time we plant, like where I was involved in a sawmill in northern Alberta,
Mm-hmm.
we planted, just to show, we planted some trees beside the mill. 20 years later, there's this large forest. Wherever we were harvesting, we planted, we respected the original, mixture of softwood and hardwood. We had to do things to make sure that there were no sight lines that favored certain predators or favored hunters and stuff. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that. And wood is a natural material. I find it very attractive. But every country has their own culture of wood.
Mm-hmm.
India has a culture of wood. Germany has a culture of wood. In North America, we have it to some extent. I think we are not as advanced in this regard, although there are pockets of strong wood culture in North America as well. In Japan, they have a very specific wood culture. It's somewhat, first of all, they're very much in love with their own species, which is understandable.
Mm-hmm.
They are somewhat perfectionist. In other words, and they do, by the way, the walls are still gyprock. Okay, it's just that in the Japanese structure, you see the exposed posts and beams.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the grain has to be absolutely straight. There can be no blemish. And so then how do you achieve, what are the origins? Where did the wood grow, that it grew straight, that the grain is straight, that it has no minor, mineral streaks or other imperfections. And so but it's just, a lot of that to my mind was misplaced focus. I had a Japanese home builder tell me, because we were very much involved in promoting the North American building system into Japan, because it doesn't require the same level of skill on the part of the carpenters, because the traditional Japanese building system is much more of a mortise and tenon joints, lots of complicated joinery, and that requires very skilled carpenters. Whereas North America carpenters are more like nail bangers, which is not.
Yeah.
They got to be no, they're skilled. I'm not doing it, but they have to know a lot of stuff. But ultimately they bang nails, or they have guns that do that. But the North American building system, it was a higher standard of comfort insofar as insulation, insofar as a number of other factors. So the Japanese focus was more, at least back in the 80s and the 70s, was more on the appearance of the wood, the sort of the piece of wood that was exposed, the tokonoma, which is this place where you put your piece of, or your scroll and stuff. And so this one Japanese builder says the Japanese home builder is more concerned about a scratch on the back of his hand than he is about the state of his lungs.
Mm.
There's a certain misplaced emphasis on appearance in Japanese. So if you want to be critical, you can say that. On the other hand, all of the culture that surrounded it, going back to temples in Nara and Kyoto, and there was so much there. And the Japanese timber trade was totally into this thing, and they had an appreciation of wood that was unique, and it was a wonderful culture to participate in. And at first I didn't know what they were talking about, and eventually I got to the point where I could look at a piece of wood and see the same things as they were seeing. But that took a while. It's like learning languages. You have to see things many, many times from many different angles before you understand what you're looking at.
Chinese tones. That was one of all the language things I've had to learn. That was the one that I probably had to put the most practice to get good at.
Tones are tough. And I think, the idea that you can remember for each character what the tone is almost unrealistic, because you can't, while you're speaking, try it. Oh, is that second tone, third tone? So you have to get to where you have a certain rhythm. You've picked up on the intonation of the language. You've seen and heard phrases so often that they come out naturally.
Yeah.
And so again, it's just a matter of enough listening that when you go to say something, you'll say it in the correct intonation, not as an individual tone, but as a collection of words, of tones in a phrase that you've heard so often that you can now reproduce it.
Yeah.
That takes an awful lot of listening.
It took a lot of listening for me, and it's not something I ever felt like I got perfect with. When I landed there day one, telling the difference between tones was, I just couldn't do it. It more or less, there was a little bit of a distinction, but it took a lot of practice and a lot of speaking, and especially a lot of listening. Fortunately, I worked in a bar when I first got there at a music venue, which ended up being a pretty great place to actually learn. I was sort of their token white guy, because they would get Western bands that would come through. And I got a lot of listening practice that way.
I think part of it is that we're convinced that having tones in a language is something very strange, and that we as non-Chinese are not going to be able to use tones correctly. The fact is that we have tones in English. Every language, to some extent, is tonal. We use tones for different purposes, for emphasis. So we can reproduce the tones.
Mm-hmm.
We have to hear them. We have to listen often enough so that we start to hear them, and eventually we can reproduce them. But the psychological idea that somehow there's something uniquely Chinese about tones and that we can't do it, no, we can do it. We do it in English, but in a different way than the Chinese do.
Mm-hmm. Learning Korean is actually pretty interesting because the way the prosody of their sentence flow is pretty specific, where it goes like da 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 da, and it
Mm-hmm.
always the da 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 is like always ending on the verb, which is like the main verb of the sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a little. Someone had to explain that to me, but once I figured that out, it actually makes understand. You start realizing that you can understand the parts of the sentence even if you didn't understand like every single word because of these sort of broken up into these little sections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I find that the prosody, if you want, the intonation of Korean is similar to Japanese.
Really?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Japanese is a language I have not studied yet. um okay, and quick question actually about studying languages is you have I don't mean this negatively, but sort of an anti-classroom pro conversation bent. And I was like using LingQ, and obviously that has a lot of listening, reading focus to it. I, by the way, am 100% with this, where classrooms are valuable to getting to that, maybe getting like to that high beginner level. But as a linguistics and Spanish major at UCLA, I graduated with a hell of a lot of people that had Spanish degrees that couldn't speak Spanish very well.
Mhm.
And so I think that kind of made me a little jaded towards the idea uh, of language education in the classroom, as well as when I got fluent in Spanish. When I first went over there, I said, I'm not going to speak any, aside from calling my parents on the weekend once a week, I'm not going to speak any English. And in about the first 3 months, I got what I would consider quite fluent. I felt very, very comfortable in Spanish, and, Madrid accent with the cerveza and like the whole thing. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that, kind of this pro conversation
So
strategy towards language learning.
I wouldn't say that I'm pro conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think to speak well, eventually you have to speak a lot. But to get to where you can speak a lot, you have to do a lot of listening and reading. So my
Yeah.
focus rather is on input, listening and reading.
Okay.
Okay. And I do that from the beginning without a classroom for languages like Persian and Arabic and Greek and every language. In the beginning, you have to listen. I find I have to listen repeatedly to the same stuff over and over again to get a
Yeah.
toehold in the language. And then gradually I move into things of interest. The trouble with the classroom is you have to get to the classroom. So now, bear in mind, when I learned Chinese, I had one-on-one instruction, 3 hours a day, every
Mm-hmm.
day. That's expensive, paid for
Mm-hmm.
by my employer, the Canadian government. So if someone pays for you to have one-on-one instruction, and there's a new teacher every hour, and you 5 minute break in between, it's a strain, but sure, that helps a lot,
Mm-hmm.
one-on-one. And then I would spend a lot of time on my own in the afternoon, listening, reading, writing, learning characters and stuff. So that was like very intense. But to sit in the classroom with 10 other people, if I have to travel half an hour to get there, plus the classroom is not cheap. Like
Mm-hmm.
it can easily cost $1,000 a month to go to a classroom with 10 other
Mm-hmm.
people. And in the classroom, some people may be better than I am. They annoy me because they're better. Some people
Mm-hmm.
are not as good as I am, and they annoy me because they're too slow. So it's just not conducive. I would rather spend that classroom hour listening and reading, or on link, looking up words, reviewing them, listening again, reading again, finding things of interest. And I mean, nowadays with podcasts, I can go to, you know, Google Podcast and plunk in something in Spanish or in any language,
Mm-hmm.
maybe not any language, but certainly the major languages. And I can find a whole bunch of podcasts
Mm-hmm.
on a subject of interest to me. And if you can learn the language from subjects of interest, you're going to learn faster. And I
Mm-hmm.
now find that I can turn that podcast on, open up Audacity, record the whole podcast. And now I've got an MP3 file.
Mm-hmm.
I've got an MP3 file. I can drag and drop it into Link, and I've got a transcript.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the podcast doesn't offer a transcript, I can create a lesson on Link. So there's so much choice out there. And not only, I can go and get books. I can look up stuff on the internet. The sky's the limit in terms of what I want to learn through the language. And if I learn things through the language, it's going to be more interesting and more effective. So I don't want to go to a class where the teacher says, today we're going to cover the colors. Today we're going to do numbers. Today we're going to do the subjunctive.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not how it works. If I come across colors all grouped together, I won't remember them. If I come
Mm-hmm.
across colors sprinkled throughout all the different things that I'm listening to and reading, eventually they will stick. Eventually.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think, and insofar as explanations, you don't require explanations. If you're not sure how a verb is conjugated, you look it up, Google,
Mm-hmm.
bingo. The dictionary, we have conjugating dictionaries on Link. If I save a verb, I can quickly click on that verb. Context reverso is one, is an excellent conjugating dictionary, and I can see the full conjugation, and I can see where this particular form of the verb fits quickly, immediately. I don't have to put up my hand, hope to attract the teacher's attention. So I just don't see the purpose. The purpose of the class is it's a social nexus. You meet other students, you make friends.
Mm-hmm.
In an ideal scenario, the teacher is very motivating. The teacher helps you find good content. The teacher encourages you. So those things, and many people need that, but personally, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I found the best language classes aside from the one-on-ones, which I did a little bit of that in Korea, which was very helpful. But also, paid good money for. The best language classes are, when I took like a Spanish poetry class or a Spanish literature class or a class about French cinema. Things where there is a subject of interest that you're talking about rather than just talking about verb conjugations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to say also, Link, what you mentioned about being able to click on the thing, see the definition, see the conjugation, get all the information. I was really impressed. As a tech guy, I'm built dozens of apps and websites and all kinds of things like that. And I've not always been super happy with all of the language learning apps that I've used, the Duolingos of the world. And I think that y'all are onto something pretty great there. And I wanted to ask, like, what's the history of Link? Like, how'd you start it? What's going on with it now?
Yeah. So we started it actually. I was learning Cantonese. It's got to be 20 odd years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And listening to the Cantonese radio station in Vancouver and heard that a Chinese immigrant had arrived at the airport with all his life savings in a bag or a briefcase and had it stolen. Apparently, there are gangs that prey. They know that Chinese immigrants come in with a whole bunch of money, and so they prey on them.
Oh God.
Anyway, I heard this, so
Uh-huh.
I contacted the local Chinese, help society or whatever. I said, in our company, we have a lumber company, but we're also building software for sawmills, and so we do have a need for tech people. This guy was a tech guy. I said, I'll give him a job, give him, he can gets 3 months of employment, help him land on his feet. If he's good, he stays. If he's not good, no harm done. And so he joined us, and his English was awful. He had a high score in TOEFL and stuff, but he really couldn't communicate in English. He didn't really understand. He wasn't connected. So I said, okay, well, we can help this guy. So we built the beginnings of Link specifically for English.
Mm-hmm.
And because the person has to understand the culture, has to understand words. So it's more for a more sophisticated language learner. I actually went out, I did a deal with a Rotary organization located about an hour or so from where I live. And I interviewed like 20 members of the Rotary, an electrician, a travel agency owner, you name it, hair salon owner, what they all did, accountant and stuff. So we had all these interviews, the head of the board of trade and stuff. and we put them up with transcripts, and we say, here's link, and here's this content that'll tell you what people in Canada do, because so many of the immigrants are culturally unconnected to the society they've moved into.
Oh, gotcha.
So we did this thing for him. We did this thing, put it up there as a fun thing to do. We tried to interest the immigration department in Canada, but a lot of people who are involved in sort of immigrant services, they're more interested in trying to claw more funding from the government rather than trying to actually help the immigrant.
Unfortunately, yeah.
And the government is kind of, to the government, the stakeholder is not the immigrant, the stakeholder is the immigrant service organization. So we got nowhere, absolutely nowhere. They didn't see it. Like, how is this going to, enable me to get more people into our classroom so we can get more funding from the government? It may help the immigrant, but like, what does it do for me, immigrant service organization? So we said, this is not going anywhere. So then we said, okay, we'll turn it into a multilingual platform where people help each other. And initially, the content on Link was people talking in their own language. So I can create content. I'm talking to my brother in English. Someone is speaking to their cousin in Spanish. So that was how it all started. But eventually, the quality of that content wasn't good enough. And so it expanded. We got better and better content and stuff like that. But it grew from this initial realization that there are a lot of immigrants who come to Canada who have some level of English expertise, who, in the case of the Chinese, they get very good at passing TOEFL, and yet they have real difficulty communicating. And part of it is a lack of vocabulary, part of it is poor comprehension, part of it is a lack of cultural knowledge. And Link could kind of, by getting the real voices of real people, enable the immigrant to get into English in a way that wasn't happening in their ESL class. But then eventually, as I said, it became a multilingual platform, and that's what it is today. And insofar as what we're doing, we're trying to, take advantage of all the new developments. Like, we were initially only on the web, and then we became mobile, Android, and iOS. And then you try to use AI for, automatic transcription. We've improved our text-to-speech functionality. Now, text-to-speech is so good. You can take a text and just convert it into text-to-speech, and it's actually pleasant to listen to, which was not the case, say, 2 years ago. 2 years ago, you had to have a natural voice, right? So, and I can't tell you all the different things because my son, Mark, runs it, but we try to stay abreast of, it used to be that the different browsers would change their operating rules every 6 months. We'd have to redesign everything. But we just try to stay abreast. And we've added a few languages just for fun. It doesn't really do much for us. Those languages aren't very widely studied, but we have Icelandic, which is free now, by the way. 2 languages are free on Link, Icelandic and Ukrainian, for different reasons. And I'd like to see Hindi on Link. We haven't, we have most of the major languages there, except for we have Gujarati for some reason, because someone decided we rely on what our members do. We have Gujarati, no one studies it. I'd like to have Hindi and Thai on there, maybe Vietnamese, but we'll see.
Gotcha. Yeah, and as someone who's I've built a lot of voice tech and a lot of browser-based speech to text transcription. I had a transcription startup for a little while. Yeah, dealing with all the different browser APIs can be a little difficult,
right?
They change a lot, and they're just slightly different enough between Chrome and Firefox that and all the others that you have to have like special code callouts for all of those.
Oh, yeah, we get people complaining it doesn't work. Oh, what's your browser? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, they've changed something. Okay, we got to deal with Firefox and Chrome and all the rest. But I don't get involved, so I just hear about it. I don't get involved.
Well, I got to ask, who does your technology? Do you have a dedicated team, or do you work with a shop, or how does that work?
No. Well, my son is in charge of our everything in the company, and we have developers in Ukraine. We have developers in Ukraine. We have one guy in Korea who's actually American. We have a fellow in Ghana. Like, we're on every continent. We have a gal in Bolivia. We have people helping us with graphics, whatever, in Macedonia. Like, we're all over. We got people. Portugal, the guy who's on our Android app is Portuguese. So I see my son, he's in Zoom, he's got all these different people on his screen that he talks to, and we do it in-house.
Oh yeah.
I
Yeah, that
mean,
was like my
contractors.
very nice. Yeah, that was like my last position. Uh the programming team was Argentina, Georgia, like country of Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
Brazil, also Portugal. A lot of programmers have moved to Portugal lately.
Mm-hmm.
And then China.
Yeah.
So so getting the time zones right, I had to wake up pretty early. It was one of the things I had to wake up super early because California, you're, the furthest west out of all of those. But it's a brave new world out there in terms of
Sure.
being able to work globally. And so I
Yeah.
found it really interesting what you said that you were pitching Link or using Link as a way not to just teach language education, but to teach cultural education. Like in
Right.
terms of people coming to Canada, it's not just see spot run or the something like that, but actually giving them like real deal information about like Canadian life and like this is to kind of help with the integration side.
Well, I mean, obviously, the more familiar you are, as we were talking earlier, as we
Mm-hmm.
were saying earlier, if you're familiar with a book or if you have prior knowledge in an area, it becomes easier to learn more about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have no prior knowledge or even interest in science fiction, so it would be difficult for
Mm-hmm.
me to read science fiction in any language. So you have these immigrants who don't understand how North American culture works. Maybe, maybe don't even want to, but that's a whole
Mm-hmm.
other issue. So you got to try to, and language is so intimately connected with culture.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they have to find something they like
Yeah.
in our culture, or they're not going to learn English. If I don't have to love everything about Japanese culture, but if there aren't some things in Japanese culture or French culture or Chinese culture that I like, that I can use for my learning, I'm unlikely to learn.
Yeah.
So, and I thought that because many of the immigrants to Canada are so-called skilled immigrants, professional, they have to have a certain level of points, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not just agricultural workers. These are people who are supposed to work in an office or factory. But even there, you got to work with other people. So you have to have some degree of cultural knowledge. And so we wanted to embody that. That's why I went with a Rotary where I could find 20 people who could talk about what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but in the end, it didn't work out. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great idea. And yeah, as you said, for me, it's science fiction. I grew up reading science fiction. My dad read science fiction. All my uncles read science fiction. We had huge boxes of sci-fi when I was a
oh, yeah.
kid.
Oh, yeah.
But it's when I was in Spain, people were always trying to read Cervantes. This is the first example that comes, and like Cervantes is great, but it's not the easiest nor the most accessible thing to just jump into as a language learner. And so I was always kind of given the same recommendation of, find something that you really enjoy, whether it's
Right.
novels, nonfiction, comic books, as long as there's words in the language and you're absorbing them, it doesn't
Right.
really matter what the content is. But the more you enjoy the content, the more you're like, literally, the more time you're going to want to spend to it and the more engaged you're going to be. You're not going to be spacing out. You're going to be interested. You're going to be, oh, what happens next? And I think all of these things also cause us to absorb the language better.
Mm-hmm.
You know, much
Yeah.
like if you're if you're talking to a really cute girl in the language, maybe you might remember the things that they say a little bit more than if you're just listening to a podcast or like you said, you're in some language class where they're talking about the subjunctive. You
Right.
know, your
For sure.
memory just naturally wants to remember those things a little bit more. Well,
Agreed.
I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I guess maybe my final question would be, what language are you learning right now, if any?
Well, I've been fighting with Persian and Arabic for the last 3, 4, 5 years, doing both of them at the same time. I mean, I have some, my Persian is much better. Arabic, of course, you have the issue that there's standard Arabic, Egyptian Arabic, Levantine Arabic. So
Yeah.
I have some understanding of all three in Arabic. Persian is better. I can listen to a podcast and I understand it quite well in Persian, not so in Arabic. But I'm very happy with what I've been able to achieve. I can read the writing system. I understand some. If I were ever to go to a place where Arabic or Persian was the language, it wouldn't take me very long to become quite fluent. But
Mm-hmm.
where I am right now, and just kind of going at it sporadically, I'm not making tremendous progress. But I enjoy
Yeah.
it. I enjoy it.
Well, I was in Morocco last year for about a month. And so I was doing all French in Morocco, and we were staying with some French friends or Moroccan friends, but French speaking Moroccans. And it was gorgeous. So if you're looking for a place to go speak Arabic, especially once we got down south to the Sahara Desert, which is beautiful beyond comprehension. But the further south you go, the further you get away from Europe, the more Arabic speaking it becomes. So yeah, I guess
Actually, my
that's
wife
my
and
big.
I were in Morocco a few years ago. We went to Fez primarily, traveled north of Fez. The interesting thing about Morocco is because their Arabic is so different from the other forms of
Mm-hmm.
Arabic, a lot of people speak standard Arabic. So they will humor me in standard Arabic. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I remember being in Montreal, jumped in a taxi with a Lebanese guy, and I started speaking to him in standard Arabic, and he says, I know you're speaking Arabic, but I don't understand you, which is extraordinary. But
Yeah.
in Morocco, taxi drivers, people in restaurants, they would speak to me in standard Arabic. They would humor me in standard Arabic. And Morocco is an amazing country. I agree with you. I didn't get south. I'd like to go again. But yeah, it's beautiful and the people are friendly and it's an interesting culture.
Yeah. Did you make it to Tangier? I think that was my favorite city there. Although we didn't go
Didn't,
to Fez.
didn't get up to Tangier, although I was in Tangier in 1965, I think.
Oh wow. That must have been a pretty interesting time to be there.
Sure.
Because I know that it was used to show up in spy novels a lot. In
Well,
the, you know,
well, we think of Casablanca, take me to the Casbah, all this stuff.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time. This has been a
Not
fascinating
at all. It's
conversation.
very enjoyable indeed. Yeah,
Yeah, and if I ever make it out to Palm Springs, I'll send you an email and maybe we can
sounds
meet for a
good.
coffee and
All right.
practice some Spanish or French or just talk about like language nerd stuff.
Sounds good. Okay, well, thank you. Enjoyed it.
No, thank you so much for your time. You take care, and I'll see you online and maybe some other time.
Okay, then. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.